Curious what you're thinking about. I have been looking into the structures of how AI companies are going to make money, and I find it very odd. So I've been looking into that. I do think we see in AI, and I mentioned this to Seth and Aspasia the other night. I think, and actually, I found out this morning that Sam Altman actually already alluded to this. I think the strategy is basically to make it too big to fail. And then once it's too big to fail, the government will have to bail it out because, like, there's a piece in Second Thoughts where we say the most rational thing you could do in capitalism is become too big to fail. And because if you can do that, then self-regulation and self-interest get divided, right? Like you can just pursue your self-interest without having to self-regulate with the customers, right? So that's the problem, is the very logic of market actually can lead people to moving outside of market forces. And that's kind of a conundrum. So I've been looking at that. I'm also trying to been going back on trying to just kind of structure belonging again to third talks, social coordination, etc. So, but I'd be curious if anyone has anything that they're thinking about. I'd love to hear it on this fine day.
Well, I literally just read an article about this, basically the corporate capitalism, right? Where corporate welfare, as is commonly stated, right? Socialize the risk, basically socialize the risk, but privatize the gain, right? That kind of language or discussion. So yeah, it's I did see also those commentaries as well. That's the move. Uh, I have my own personal research projects I'm working on. Mostly I've been working on, I guess, this interfacing of design and technology with the human subject. And that's just been, I've been writing a couple articles about this. So I find the kind of relationship to the imagination, right, which is kind of what we're doing with this work with AI, is just a processing of phantasms, right, that supposedly will unlock massive value, supposedly. But open questions about where that value is being emphasized or where we're going to see it. Mostly because we even see by this now, I think we're in the third generation of startups with AI, and they keep having to push, well, this is the value you're getting from it. And I think also there's been all the other commentaries about that investigation of the actual generated value of AI at best a wash, at best, if not basically a cost sink from the get-go. So I just find this very interesting that supposedly if AI was supposed to replace the human, we're not actually seeing generation of any kind of of any real value being generated. Not even productivity, but even just value. I just find that interesting. I think, Dan, I think of your notes about the kind of economists you've been interested in with creativity, that maybe you've been almost been vindicated. Except that, quite frankly, our models are saying, no, we just need more AI. We just need more. This is going to work, guys. We just need more. We just need to put more investment, more activity, more contribution, and then we're going to see the results. I'd leave it back to you, Daniel.
No, I think corporate welfare is, and Dimitri, wonderful to have you, sir. I think it is very clear to me that the model of AI is to basically, because right now we see basically the global economy is dependent on seven companies, the Mag Seven, right? And let's say Nvidia beats earnings, but they don't beat it as well as people want. That alone could send a shockwave around the entire world that could cause untold economic difficulty. I mean, there's arguments to be made that it is a mistake to compare it to the dot-com bubble because a number of the AI companies are indeed generating revenue. Like there's actual money being made. So there's a difference there. It is true that I don't believe at this point the market is as frothy. Actually, it's hard to believe this, but apparently I don't think, like on the Buffett indicators, P ratios, it actually is not as bad as the dot-com bubble at this point. Now, of course, you could argue, well, it's not as bad because they're all in a circle of financing one another to cover that up. So, you could make that argument. And you could say, well, it's not as bad simply because of the GPUs. But you could say, but all of this assumes that the GPU actually is going to generate value, which, of course, if it reverses, then all of that supposed revenue that makes the AI bubble not as bad as the dot-com bubble actually is false because it's useless infrastructure, right? And you could actually argue if you build out all these data centers and then there's not value to be made, that's also negative because then you're stuck with this. And of course, the electricity costs, blah, 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 et cetera, and so forth. But so it's, I see more and more people are saying, is it a bubble? But the whole point is that if you have a global condition that is dependent on seven companies, This is remarkably precarious. Now, again, I think Palantir at one point had a 600 PE, which is completely insane. But you know, if you say, well, one day, everyone, one day, it will all prove itself. But there's a few things, you know, not to say too much more, but I'll pass it to Dimitri here, and we can talk about anything. I've just been looking more and more at the business models. Um, I'm not sure. There's something about the idea that you can add AI to the economy that I almost question. Because if AI even worked, it would be a paradigmatic shift. It would change what markets are. Like, I don't know if you can add it. Like, there's an interesting way in which that would be the fulfillment of capitalism as a kind of blossoming into something that is radically different in kind, right? Like, there's something about the idea of adding it because it would displace labor so much, right? Like, you know, Cadell will talk about the dream of capital and the dream of labor, right? If capital is entirely free of labor, is it still capitalism? You know, you could say, no, it's ultra capitalism because ultra capitalism is capital entirely free of labor, right? Well, it would be a very different sort of notion from what we're used to. I think also what we're seeing with AI is also, and I'll pass it to Dimitri after this. There's always been a long argument between people like Hayek and Carl Planier. And Carl Planier wrote The Great Transformation. And Planier argued, who Dietrich McCloskey does not like at all. So, you know, I always find that fun because I like McCloskey a lot, but I have to be sympathetic to Mr. Planier. He's also brothers with the great Michel Planier. So, you know, Michael, good to see you. So, you know, in The Great Transformation, the great argument is that basically governments had to force people into capital markets. Like, it was not a clean transition where everyone was convinced of, oh, we're on the farms, but we want to be part of capital markets, so we'll move to the cities. No, there was more of a kind of forcing by government policy. It was more of a strong hand effort to get people to participate in it, right? You could also link that argument, of course, to ways I like to talk about the American Civil War. And I think other civil wars actually are like this, right? Well, if Carl Planier is correct, you know, other people argue against it. They say, no, markets are rational. People join markets because it was in their best interest. And of course, perhaps that is true once you start thinking according to the social imagination of markets, but actually getting people into the social imagination of markets can kind of be forceful and actually be a terrible experience, right? AI might actually end this debate between people like Carl Planier in more of the Austrian sort of people, because we will actually see live what occurs when you radically sift markets if people go into them willingly, because I think AI is not merely something you add to capitalism. It is a change of social imagination. It is more paradigmatic. It's like a deeper thing, right? Do people, according to rationality, go right on in? Or is actually a paradigmatic shift something that cannot be reduced to a rational calculus because ultimately it involves a certain non-rational choice according to assumptions of what it is going to do, imaginings, libido, etc., so forth, right? I see AI as actually bringing the great debate, and these are shocking my ear continually. I must have done something. That's cool. That's fun. That's me. I'm talking about AI, so it's actually sending this to destroy my hearing. It's like, you're done. But I think we actually might see, in a way, a case study of that old debate between someone like Planier and Hayek that's actually going to play out with AI. So I've been thinking about that as well. But let me give it to Dimitri. Dimitri, it's wonderful to see you, sir. I hope you have been doing well. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, thanks. And I've been busy, so I couldn't go to the net with university and linguistics. And Jochen, thanks for bringing AI to the conversation. I think that's such a hot topic, and I just want to tell you guys about some things I've been seeing at the university with AI. So now they're starting to do courses by professors on how to write with AI. So you don't have to write anymore. You don't have to think anymore, right? And not only this, if you don't take the course itself, but you just take, let's say, social linguistics, which is one of the courses I do. Well, I turned in a paper, and the teacher said, well, actually, you should write it with AI. So I'm also getting my thinking taken from me. But then at least I'm making friends at uni who are telling me that in difficult social situations, just ask ChatGPT like how to deal with it, right? When you're lonely, when you don't know what to do with yourself, when you're like having problems with a girl or whatever, your family. And so being at uni, this has been this like I've been here since like September. Like there's things I'm not an A plus student or whatever. I just want to get good enough grades because for me that's already hard enough. And it's not that the content itself is hard, but I'm actually dealing a lot with working through my psychological resistance that I have by learning the way in which they want me to learn. One of the reasons is because it is not really conducive to the type of conversations that we need to have, like, and that we are having here on the net, which I'm very grateful for. And so I do think that university at this point is a beacon of taboo and a beacon of censorship. That much is evident. Yeah, it's definitely not a beacon of free creative thought. So at the same time, I appreciate Chomsky linguistics. I see also that there's no subject in it. I can also see that you can try to calculate your way into predicting objective mechanisms, so you don't have to think the subject. That's something that happens with Chomsky linguistics and many other, I would say, obsessional disciplines. I think pragmatics is a good example of this too, especially with John Searle. Of course, I mean, I've read his work. I need to read it for uni. Like, you can scroll on his Wikipedia page and see how his sex life was. He was harassing and abusing all these younger female students. And when he was in his 70s and 80s, which is absolutely insane. So, I mean, and of course, we don't talk about that at uni, but at the same time, I do want to open up a conversation about like femininity and masculinity, because to me, university is like very evidently a feminized environment. This is why you can see that the ratio male-female actually skews towards female. And that's also why you can see that women tend to excel way more in this system. I have guy friends who are like decided just not to go to college or uni, just given up on these type of institutions, whereas women tend to excel at conforming. And I mean, I'm seeing these people at uni, like starting uni at 25 and not having lived there, I can see that there's a lot of people there who don't know how it is to not be in an institution. They don't know how it is to like have to deal with life, and by life I mean also like money and like the hard things of like what are you actually gonna do. And so for them, university can be a way like provide a safety, but at the same time, they don't really get to cultivate themselves in a way that I would like to be seen as. What is that way? So I think like to give the example of the net, I think one of the things the net is great at is that we all get to work through our own narcissism, because speech, there's something super narcissistic about speech and forcing others to listen to you and like having to respond to you, right? We've talked about taking that freedom away, of not having to make a choice. Then you like that, and like this, but okay. So, but at the same time, when I'm speaking like this, and when I hear you guys talking, it's always very like a free associative way. So we express doubts, we express where we're not so sure, we express where we're not completely finalized and concluded our thoughts. But at the uni, it's the other way around. Like, it's like I get taught the finished product, and I should be able to reproduce it as quickly and as accurately as possible. And the quicker and more accurate you are, let's say you get an A and after half hour you walk out of the exam room, then you're like a good student. But I'm not like that, and I don't give a shit about that type of knowledge. Of course, I love phonological features and rules, and to know how the place of articulation determines assimilation and coalescence and all kinds of interesting linguistic phenomena, or the nature of speech acts in discourse and semantics and whatever, like universal grammar, how languages are different to each other, but also there's universal logic to language that can be uncovered. I mean, that's all great to me, and at the same time, I want to take that and then be able to raise the conversation, and that's really for me the value of it. And so what I'm noticing is that, okay, so I think we should make a distinction, maybe for the sake of this conversation or whatever. Like, that's how I've been thinking, between what I call philosophical science. And an example of that would be actually Noam Chomsky. He's not only a linguist, he's also a philosopher. He's read early modern philosophy. He knows his stuff. Like you can have a serious conversation with him about Descartes, Hume, Leibniz, like all these guys, and also 19th century stuff. And then there's dogmatic science. So dogmatic science, actually, it's quite prevalent, I would say, in linguistics. Might also be the case in other disciplines. I can't say too much about that, but it's a type of scientism that does not want to answer the philosophical questions of why and how. Like, what is your method? And what is the very goal? Like, what's the final cause, to speak in a classical philosophical way? What's the final cause of your activity? Like, why do you give a shit? Are you in? I think, yeah, I mean, something like John Searle and pragmatism very obviously does not want to get into that question, right? And so there's a whole theory by Jacques Lacan on how different discourses work, and there's a master's discourse. So it's a master telling you, giving you knowledge, you being hysterical towards that knowledge, but still you're working within the paradigm of the master, rebelling against it or whatever. And then there's the university discourse, which actually says that there is no master, there's just knowledge, and just, let's say, maybe cognitive science as the best way to approach that. And then you do not get to unearth who are the masters of this discourse. And so I think this also has a lot to do with pedagogy or didactics, in the sense that there's top-down learning and there's bottom-up learning. And top-down learning would be like, here's the science of logic. Let's look at the categorization. It goes from like being to absolute idea. Here you get like a simplified but kind of neat picture of what you're going to get. And bottom-up learning would just be opening up the first chapter, not knowing what's at the end of it, but just working through the very concept. And actually, I have 2 points with this. One, I always learn better when I get a top-down thing first, when I know why should I care about it in the way that I should to get the best out of it. And another point is that I think women tend to do better with bottom-up learning. And of course, there's a balance to be struck here. But I do notice that with my male and female professors, there's especially some female professors who really do not want to get into the big questions. And I think it's more masculine or phallic, so to say, to posit like, okay, this is the project. And I mean, that masculinity can even be there in women. Like I'm seeing it also with female professors. Like I think there's something great about it. But the problem with this type of thing is that, let's say you know everything about Austronesian languages, and then you get a question about whatever the Slavic language family, or maybe Proto-Indo-European or universal grammar, or whatever, like the way our tongue moves. Like, of course, you're gonna say, I don't know about that. I'll just defer you to some other scientist. But the problem with that is that you're always like, there's still a belief in that, and that's the belief of science, namely the belief in the scientific community, and that there is someone out there who knows, even though I may not know, right? And in psychoanalysis, this is called the subject supposed to know. There's always a subject out there who is knowing for us, and so we don't have to know it ourselves, because we can just let them know for the sake of us. And so there's no responsibility to take for the larger picture. And this is the thing you get with academic specialization. And so that's another problem I'm seeing. And I mean, I just hope I'll be able to, like, there's great things about the system, but because I'm there and I do not get to be critical of it, and also with people I'm meeting there, like, I do not get to be this critical with it. I'm just glad I got the space to do it here. So thanks for listening to that.
Magnificent. And so first off, I never thought I'd hear that the professor's like, you really should use ChatGPT. It would really help the writing out. That's something. Second, it's windy, so if my internet gives me trouble, I apologize. Third, that idea of there always being a subject that knows, I think that's the dream of AI, right? Once we get AI, there will actually be a subject who always knows, and that will be an ultimate sort of completing that dream. That is, I think, tied to the quote-unquote master discourse. And I think, though, it's just very interesting because there's something I am also just very interested. Like there's all these people, like I think in Japan, people like leaving their spouses, marrying ChatGPT. We're seeing the relationships and different things. What's just very interesting is that Derrida once said, and famously it was asked, if you could ask Hegel and all those cats something, what would you guys said? I'd ask about their sex life, right? Which sounds like a joke and it's kind of funny, but actually it is pointing to something pretty profound, which is I think basically a lot of the quote unquote discourses are avoiding libidinal, avoiding sex, avoiding desire, and that's where psychoanalysis and different things come in, and that's what we see in Cyril. Because I think also, funny enough, basically when you avoid the why and how questions, I think you end up repressing sexuality. You repress sex and libidinal, right? Those things go together. And the issue is actually I think, is acting as a case study for this. Because the issue is you can just other all the people who are, say, loving their ChatGPT or falling. You can say, well, they're just weirdos. Well, that's the othering. We've learned we're not supposed to do that, are we? I thought Foucault and all those cats said we're not supposed to. Or no. What's going on there is the revelation of what occurs if you don't get into the how and why questions, right? Because people still have desire and libidinal. They still have. And these things absolutely get habituated. What ends up happening is, unfortunately, we can desire to avoid responsibility. So we quote unquote are erotic, we fall in love, which that can help us avoid responsibility. The beauty possible in a relationship is on the other side of taking responsibility. But that's something that has to be worked through, right? That's overcoming in marriage. We'll talk about overcoming the honeymoon phase, right? Like you fall in love and that's good, that can be great. And there's a certain naivety that's there. Hopefully not too much, because then you'll be overwhelmed by Beatrice's smile, if you will. But there's a certain sort of working through the difference, taking responsibility to get to the beauty on the other side of taking responsibility. Well, what if you could theoretically just stay in the honeymoons, forever, right? Like, what if you could theoretically keep the honeymoon going forever, right? Well, that's what ChatGPT is going to do, right? That's kind of the idea, right? The spurious, if you could literally just keep it going somehow, that's kind of the dream. Now, of course, I think accomplishing this would, of course, require building so many data centers that you destroy the world, but that's fine, I guess. Whatever, it's practical. So I think also lurking in a lot when I was hearing you speak, it does make me think the lurking issue of the libidinal that I think is going to only become more and more pronounced. I think, look, when I was at university, I salute you, Dimitri, and I appreciate you being here, given all the work of the university, and I'll give it to Michael here. Yeah, I basically would fall asleep in class and go work on the Sword of Tribulation in the library. But I found the Jefferson Literary Society, and basically became a kind of spaces of this sort of discourse, which then have that certain creativity, which if you don't have, I think is very problematic. There is something to be said. I think it is very important, though, not to demonize the quote-unquote university. That's not the right route, but it's figuring out how to work it with the creative possibilities, which a hope of mine is that AI will actually kind of be a forcing function to make that be taken more seriously. I think also, for me, a characteristic of, like you say at the neck, yes, the individual talks, and there's a certain narcissism in that. But what's funny is you're trying to work to that place of self-forgetfulness, right? Like I find in discourse, like the creativity begins when actually you get to the place where in a relationship, you enter into that certain self-forgetfulness, right? Whereas in a master discourse or where you're trying to show that you know things, like you're not trying to forget yourself, right? You're actually trying to assert yourself the entire time. And that becomes a very different, like we have to tarry with the subject. And the question is how to do it in the right way. And I think the particular containers of discourse that we have can become very big for that. But I will pause and I will give it to Michael and then Mr. Jockin, and if anyone else wants to speak. Thank you for what you shared, Dimitri. Michael, please.
Yeah, I just also want to say thank you, Dimitri, for kind of explicating that and the masculine feminine differences in university. That really helped clarify, I think, a lot of similar thoughts that I've had. I'm currently also in a master's program in marriage and family therapy, and recently graduated from undergrad. And like right before this, I was doing this assignment where we're in a law and ethics class, and so we're learning about like pre-degree, like pre-licensure, post-licensure, like all of the requirements in terms of like our practicum experience and hours we have to accrue and all of that. And we had to like read our state's licensing board requirements basically for graduation. And we had to do a discussion post last week where we kind of just summarized like what we learned. And then I missed this assignment, but then we had to write a 2 to 3 page paper summarizing what we read. And then like in the like the prompt, the like description for the assignment, our professor's like I don't want this to simply just be like a copy paste, or bullet points of like, what you read. Like I really want it to like showcase what you learned. And I'm like, well, how do you want me to just basically regurgitate? Like you're asking nothing of me in like the form of analysis or like, like anything. It's just like pure summarization. And I had the intrusive thought of just using ChatGPT, but I was like, no, I can't come on the net and flog ChatGPT and then stoop to that level. But I'm like, what is the point of this assignment? Like, it's so silly. I mean, I felt myself in a way like learning and digesting the material by actually having to write it out instead of just reading it. So like I do recognize that value, but there's nothing by the way of like critical thinking. And in general, my program is actually very like embodied and very focused on like the individual and our like creative process in moving towards becoming a therapist. So like in general, it's actually very different than my undergrad experience. But I wanted to pick up on what Dimitri was talking about with like the kind of feminine uh impulse, I don't know if that's the right word, to um for kind of conformity and like kind of that bottom up learning as opposed to like the top down learning. That's definitely something I witnessed in undergrad as a sociology major at a California state school. There was, it was kind of like very much swept up in the postmodern kind of ideology. And, much of the discussions were kind of like of that of that ilk. And there was just like a lot of like comfortability and kind of just making these like grand assumptions or like presuppositions about reality. And like you mentioned, Dimitri, it's like these are like white girls from the suburbs who like are like 19 and they're like making these like grand proclamations about, like who's the like real boogeyman for, the state of the world today. And, it happened to be people that looked like me most of the time. And so it didn't feel terribly warm and inviting. But then there was always this like air of like, no, we're like, we're inclusive and we're like, we're understanding. And and I think like because I was in that environment and now I'm like in, like a counseling program and I've worked in the environmental sector, like all very female dominated um areas. I think I've felt like, well, to fit in, I mean, to conform, I have to kind of, conform and kind of just go along with that and kind of like it's almost like you kind of sacrifice your ability to question and speculate for kind of an identity, like being part of an in-group. Because like if you like the quickest way to kind of ostracize yourself in like a university setting is to be like the skeptic, right? Like that's not a stance that most people take, because I think a lot of people like grow up in like middle school, high school, kind of with that like very top down, without the explanation of like why you are studying calculus, right? And so they get to university and it's kind of this like time of I mean, I don't know. It's like this interesting kind of like dis like um disconnect because like on one side, like people in university age are very open and very like questioning and like kind of open to experience, but then they're also at the same time, I think because of that chaos and that kind of ungrounding are also looking for like security and like answers and a desire to assert their voice and to find their voice. Um and so I think there's like I notice with a lot of my peers and my friends, like within the walls of the university, they were very self-assured. And then as soon as they got out, it was like, oh my gosh, like what am I going to do when I graduate? Like who am I going to date? Like, how am I going to find out? Blah, 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 like, how am I going to make money? Like, so there's this like interesting, um, yeah, just like polarity. And then we die. Like this polarity between, um, those identities and yeah, I'm also just like thinking a lot about so I'm in this online poetics and literature community that's spearheaded by this now former Harvard professor of poetics and literature. His name's Dr. Adam Walker. He's been kind of gaining in popularity. Like he recently just had a talk with Mark Vernon at the Harvard Divinity School about William Blake, and like John Vervaeke like knows about him. His like YouTube account is like kind of really taking off, and his Substack as well. And he's talking about like the decline of the English departments, and the kind of decline of like literacy and the decline of just like overall interest in the classics, and kind of what's happened to the English major. Like at a certain point it was something like 8% of all degrees were in English, like at some point in the 20th century. And since in the last decade, it's gone down by like a third. And now, there's some English degrees that you can graduate without even reading Shakespeare, which is crazy. Um, and and he kind of talks about how like there's this new like emergent, he calls them like the new shepherds of um like English professors, but kind of also like autodidacts and people on YouTube like him who are teaching like outside of the walls of the institutions, and how there's kind of this like there's this birth of a potential renaissance of like a re-interest in in the old, in the classics, in critically like engaging with them and dialoguing in groups, like not just like reading them on your own and being satisfied with that. And I definitely feel it in this community. I mean, we're reading, the Breton Lays right now and Canterbury Tales, and there's people from all walks of life, all like, male and female, young and old, like and we're all like coming together with this kind of energy and fervor to like make meaning um out of these texts. And it's a really beautiful thing, and it's so unlike the university system. And I wonder if part of that is due to like the assignment kind of like class for credit system, as opposed to like being intrinsically motivated towards something. I feel like those hierarchies are necessary to like keep people, in a, I don't know, in a program. I don't think it can just be like totally just the net style all the time, but I'm also like, that's how I learned the best. And I also need a why. I think I also need like someone, a professor who's like genuinely loving what they're doing to like to pull me in. But yeah, I'm going all over the place, but
No,
it's great to be
no.
here.
I think that's magnificent. And Cleo and Christian, wonderful to have you. Christian, I had a wonderful time yesterday speaking. I've been writing notes ever since. So thank you for that. And Cleo, always an honor. Thank you for being here. And no, I think what you're getting at, I'll pass it to Jochen and then Daniel just quickly. On that idea of leaving the university and there's a certain paralysis, one of the reasons that's so concerning about AI is not only do I think economically it's basically working by creating a too big to fail situation, so they'll be bailed out. I think that is the strategy. There is also an issue where once people get habituated to talking to ChatGPT, using ChatGPT, then you become scared not to use it. It creates a certain comfort within it. And it's kind of like you're just gradually trapped is what's occurring, I think, basically with AI is you're gradually just being brought in via small habits where you get to the place where then you can't function without it. You're too scared to deal with real people or something, real situations. And then the pig is stuck in the cage or different things. So there's an enclosure that starts going on. And I mean, also, yeah, like, also, if there's this idea that the global economy is held up by 7 companies, and you start going, hey, it looks like AI is going to actually release a biological weapon and destroy us all, you basically go, well, it doesn't matter. We have to take that risk because otherwise the global economy, like there's a very pernicious sort of spiritual warfare. Like more and more, it is very interesting that more and more people are using the language of spiritual warfare to describe our moment, right? You know, obviously Land and Downey's work, but more and more people, because there is this kind of feeling of principalities kind of putting you in a certain corner, just to allude to that for just a moment. But I also noticed when you said conform, it hit me. It's like conform, fake form. Oh, cool. So I enjoyed that wordplay for a moment there. That was lovely. I think also if there's any hope is that I do think when you talk about a group online like that, then the professor or the teacher, the people know, oh, well, the people must actually value this. Like there's no ambiguity, right? Where in the university, if they're in the class, you're not sure if they value it or if they just want the accreditation, right? There's an ambiguity there, right? Where there's a loss of ambiguity, I think it opens up relationality and potential. If there's any hope with AI, if it's like, well, nah, you ain't going to get a job going to college because AI is going to take all the jobs, well, then you'll know everyone at college is genuine. Then you'll know everyone studying literature is honest because you're not going to be getting a job. So is there an irony where is there a glimmer of hope in AI taking all the jobs that then it would actually remove ambiguity about people's motivations if they're interested in different things? But of course, they may say, it's basically going to get down to intrinsic motivation or nihilism. Because like if you get to the place where there's like no extrinsic motivation because AI does all of the extrinsically motivated tasks, it's basically a matter of life and death to have intrinsic motivation, which gets into belonging again to and the ability to choose to value something, habitually, et cetera. But I will stop and give it to Jochen and then Daniel if anyone else wants to speak. Mr. Jochen, please.
As a person in the university, I can say, yeah, all these accounts from Dimitri and Michael are 100% accurate. It's a brave new world out here, man. I think obviously the first note, and then this is actually a legitimate problem in the sense of, here's the issue we have in academics, is that we have, unless you pre-select people coming into the program, there's a gigantic spread of ability, interest, motivation. It's the problem of the spread that's actually the main problem. So the problem with the thing like the net, this is a pre-selected filtered group. So that's why there's a kind of tight boundedness in our general capacity, interests, etc. Even though there are differences. So the problem of the university is that what happens when you have gigantic spread, which has actually been generally a problem with our geopolitical cultural norms, is that we don't know what to do with the spread. I mean populational spread. We just say, basically our mode has been, you know what? Best of luck to you. Let the best do well, and everybody else, you'll figure it out. And that's and that is 100% the academic disposition. It's not that people don't care. It's not that people wish there were other alternatives. It's just that in the dynamic of when we have, again, people go, okay, if I can deal with the friction of actually working with thought, or I can let ChatGPT do the thought for me, why am I going to do the calculus? And especially, I think a big note is the duration of 15 weeks, 12 weeks, 16 weeks. That's a long time. And it's it's holding attention for that long period of time. I think every academic will tell you you never get the same output. There's half-living of intention, of energy. Uh, and one could debate about this in the sense of is the I say this related to academics. Part of the problem is what happens to the people who don't even know what they need and not even exposure. But you can't just pre-qualify the people who pre-select for it because some people never encounter it until they were forced into a situation where they had to encounter it and had to work with thought, encounter new things they didn't consider before. This is a problem typically of like maximalization of utility, right? Where if I don't see the min-max value of me doing this thing, why am I going to do the thing? Like, why am I going to expose myself to reading Dante? Right? When it doesn't help me get me a job or help me with, and it's the thing, even the way the schools try to deal with this, just say, well, you have to do certain credits to humanities, and this is what you got to do. That's kind of the answer. But I say this too also because to do the work of I'll tell you my students right now, actually have the students do the work of actual thought. Do you know how intense that requires? Like it really is a tutoring mechanism. And we know it's education. In education, we do know the tutor model, the one-on-one tutor is the model. It is the way to learn because it requires this attenuation. It's basically Plato's rhetoric, right? From Phaedrus. It's that attenuation to the particular individual, the draw out, and then by dialectics of distinction, working through to draw out a new understanding for those in that individual, right? In living thought, as opposed to, deferment of an expert to just regurgitate, which is, by the way, this is the consequence of like, well, we can't do that. So the best we can do is just maximize the likelihood that you obtained replication of information. So that's generally how this works out. We have replicate information of a master designifier that we can regurgitate this information out. The arts and the fields are not that much different. It's if they do this in the sense that typically we have a rubric, you got to hit the rubric. And actually, most of the art professors will speak here, all of us in the art, theater, music. We actually have pangs where we have rubrics, but the rubrics are always failures. Meaning, it's not like if a student actually achieved the rubric, like did it to the letter, what the rubric said, and they do great work. It's like, it's this issue of the rubrics give you absolute minimum. I'm kind of circling back now to this point in the beginning, which is what do we do with this huge spread of population? In the sense that measures give you the minimum. They give you the limit, the line of the barrier line of acceptance, but it's never excellence, at least in the activity of the arts. So it doesn't work, but it's the best we got because under these mechanisms, there's no way to be intelligible within the mechanism system of the algorithm of the educational structure. So, by the way, and the tension is with AI, if the purpose of this process is the reproduction of information, and AI can do it better, why not? AI is going to do it. Students are going to absolutely render it because then it just gets you the job you need done faster. Now, actually, some teachers and me have been thinking of some ideas about that, how to render with this. I think in general, as a general outline, this was a big issue when Duchamp came with the fountain, where he found a urinal, recontextualized it that this is art now. And generally the response to that, or the idea of that, has been to say, well, there's things like found art, or the thing is, it's not the making of the artifact necessarily that makes it art, it's the rearrangement and the new context you place it in. So what I mean by that is, we're thinking through, and again, giving a positive statement. How can we use the AI renditions to not just stop, like that's not making these just the artifact, but how to use them as material for thought to work with it. I think in general, the idea is usually AI gives you very homogenized, very smooth understandings of thinkers or objects or things. And it's more like how can we draw contrast? How can we draw surprise? How can you draw distinction from the thought? And actually, a good idea is usually to let students, actually a good tip is actually let students read out loud what's been produced. And they kind of get that tinge of like, that's not really what I wanted to say. I think that's quite important. When you get that sense of tension of when the AI gives you an output and it doesn't capture what you're trying to say. That difference is actually where you can actually draw something out of that. But as a somewhat positive claim about it, will just require reading out loud. And I know some teachers have done actually a return of an oral examination on purpose to try to work this through. So I'll stop with that.
I love that. Make them read it out loud. Nice. Oh, that's great. They're very interesting. I appreciate everything you're saying. When you mentioned, I'll give it to Daniel and then Michael, and if anyone else wants to speak. I'm thinking more because, people like Zach Stein will talk about this and other individuals. Why couldn't AI, and this is an open question, and I've been thinking about this, and, so some people are arguing or suggesting, well, hey, AI could be a tutor. Everyone could have their own private tutor, right? AI could be the private tutor and it would be customized to you, et cetera, so forth, right? So maybe AI could actually make possible the best form of education for everyone because everyone could have an AI tutor, right? My intuition is that's somehow wrong. That's my intuition. I want to unpack why. There's a part of me that kind of thinks like, what's wrong with that? There's a part of me, because what are all the things? Now, that's just an open question. Mr. Jockin, please.
I got to jump in because because AI's model is self-confirmation.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
That's the problem. That's 100% the problem.
Yeah.
And I know from using these tools, you have to proactively tell it, no, I want you to be critical of me. I want you to talk through what's not working. Yeah. So I'll close.
No, because to me, that's exactly right. That's where my brain goes. Because I think there's something important about even stuff like mishearing the teacher in the back of the room or making the choice to sit in the front of their back or being around other people, like all of that context. And I think you were alluding to that, is that, your wonderful exhibit, everything's going to go more and more in the direction of, I think, space making, thinking space, like how to create a space that draws out the subject in different ways. I think that's exactly right. Before I forget, I also on that idea of people why would I read Dante if it doesn't get me a job? Well, maybe a world's coming where nothing gets you a job. So that's, Dante's great. If nothing gets you a job, the humanities come roaring back, right? So that's all great. But I think there is this question of why can't AI be a tutor is very interesting to unpack. I think the confirmation problem is there. I think also, in a conversation like this, or in conversations that surprise you, there's always a constant kind of judgment of what is fitting to say, right? What would be the appropriate thing to see? And it may even seem out of left field, but actually left field was perfect because it actually spiced stuff up or brought stuff up. Could AI, the tutor, do that, right? Different questions like that. There's a lot to unpack there. I will pause, though, and I will give it to Daniel, Michael, and Christian. Daniel, please. Good to have you, sir.
I guess the first thing would just be to reflect on how much I'm enjoying and appreciating getting snippets of Dimitri's journey through university. It was a few months ago that I made a decision. I remember being a little surprised. The feeling, I don't know if I'm still here, everyone's frozen.
Lekker. Dis die ding is ons sê hierso. Dimitri requested some Afrikaans. It's chaos. Ek verstaan niks. Michael de Klerk from the church. Of the church. De Klerk. Yeah. My mother's maiden name is Van Mushenbroek, which means bird in the pants. Van Mushenbroek. And Van Niekerk is of no church. There's a very funny story of when those surnames were recorded. I think it was when Napoleon was collecting names for tax reasons after his expansion, and the Dutch kind of took the piss. That's the law that I have around some of those surnames. But I don't know if it's true. Maybe we should check ChatGPT. It will hallucinate and tell me that it's correct. But I think this is the value of GPT, that it does hallucinate. But if you're using it with that sense, then that confirmation is actually, it can be helpful because it's this it's almost a partner that can help you air out a thought. It's a certain reflection. But I think there's obviously the dangers that we've we've been mentioning. It can't be the final tutor, but it can be a thought partner, I think. I have to confess that I've enjoyed my own hallucinations, but it's only recently that I've really solidified that idea that it's mostly reflecting back my own bias, or whatever you name that. But I think I was saying that how much I've been appreciating Dimitri feeding in his experiences, and it's kind of in the territory that can be expected. It's kind of opposite to. I remember writing in like my 4th year at university, after I was kind of corrupted by someone who taught us Plato, and I started expanding a little bit in practice and in writing what I thought and writing what I wanted to say. And there was an essay on conspiracy theories, and I really I went for it, or conspiracy thinking from like a philosophical angle, and I went for it, and I was punished for going for it. And then the next essay, I just gave the lecturer what I knew that he wanted, and then I got good marks. And then I stopped looking at my marks after that. It was incredibly disheartening, and I also felt dirty for doing that. It was not a good. Yeah, it felt like it violated something. Yeah, I couldn't do that anymore. I think it's relevant that the corruption kind of came from Plato and from someone really steeped in Platonic philosophy, because it's this question of the lack of the question or the lack of the answer in the institution, as we are speaking about it, of why, like what is the vision. It's just we almost are so traumatized by the potential power of that question and possessing an answer to it in institutional form that we've kind of like recoiled from that. So there's just this absence, and then that kind of leads me to wonder what that vision would be. I think there's like part of the philosophical work is just creating the conversational space that reminds the fact that there is something like that is necessary, that there is a vision. So this is often like where there's an avoidance of that question, it exposes the implicit or the kind of invisible operating vision. That because something has to be operating there in the lack of the address. But then taking that on directly, it's not clear what direction that should go. I mean, in a South African context, often it's sometimes things can seem so dire, or so there's almost like a potential in the way that it can seem so bad, because then it's a degree of radicality can be brought in or proposed. Like maybe it's bad enough that we can try something. This thing of just the amount of violence and nonsense that we are able to put up with just to keep the sense of something continuing or repeating, just to keep the sense of like a kind of a normality. It's frightening, both, and that's true at like an institutional level as well as a personal and interpersonal level. Is the violence that we put up out of fear of something like freedom, or this question of why. I had a question coming in, and Daniel, you initially asked, like, or you're pointing at this like the rationality of capital and how is AI going to make money. But I think it's kind of also a question that's been at least loosely associated to some of the other threads in the conversation. That is like, why should I not steal? Like sometimes you can come to a question and the necessity of just asking a question. Maybe you need to explain to someone who's caught in a habit of stealing, like why is it not a good thing to steal? How many people have an account for that? Like, how can you give a reason? Can we answer that question? That's my kind of like, I think the hysteric question that I'm coming in with. Like, why not steal? Why not expand? Why not, like why not just overtake everything? Yeah, but the heart of it is, I think the stealing. Maybe there's a connection with the use of AI. There's a manner of stealing something there. But I think the heart of this question is like, how do we, can we ask that? Can we answer it? Let me put it down.
That's very interesting. So I love that, and thank you. So it was interesting too. So first off, I think I'm sorry that you had an experience in the university where you experienced that they wanted you to be a chat GPT. That's really too bad. And that devastates. Yeah, that's a wake up. I had experiences like that. And it is very discouraging. But luckily Plato corrupted you. I'm glad that occurred. So that's very good. But it also, like, there's a way in which there's something almost just for the ChatGPT to be causing an existential crisis on universities because universities made students be ChatGPT. So there's a kind of poetic justice in that, in a funny way. That I think about. Now, of course, there are good professors that do not do this, like William Wilson or Jochen here, that actually encourage that waking up. But it's unfortunate that it is so rare. What you're saying about Clayton, I love what you said in the chat too. There is a funny way in which ChatGPT doesn't hallucinate. It just doesn't. We call it hallucination because we know it's wrong, right? So there's a kind of there's something about the hallucination that actually necessarily suggests an involvement of the human being, and in that way, there's a use in the hallucination as a kind of reminder of the human actually being involved, right? Like if you didn't have the human involved, then it's kind of that Lewis thing on locked from the inside. Like if you don't know something, then there is nothing you don't know, right? So like if AI totally entrapped you, its hallucinations would not be hallucinations, and that would be final damnation. Hence the importance of keeping that human element involved. So I think that was lovely. I am thinking this idea of, well, how do you not steal? Why not steal? I guess why you were talking, and it brought to mind some of the conversation I was having with Christian as well, and I'll give it to Michael and then Christian, does the why question, because there's an argument to be said, universities, people avoid the why question because it eternally regresses, right? Like it always leads to another why and it goes on. So there's this idea that is therefore not productive. Like we don't ask it because it won't get us anywhere, right? Now, this assumes that the very process of asking why questions upon why questions doesn't change the subject in the process of asking those ever why questions in an important way, of course. You're assuming the process of the whys doesn't matter, only the end, which of course is a pragmatist mindset in of itself, right? It has a certain metaphysics embedded in that judgment. But there's also something like, what does it mean to ask why if you can never, as we talk about with Hegel and other philosophers, if you must always avoid presuppositions, right? Like we talk with Korobowski, I was talking with Christian about this, that it's dangerous to talk about an isness, right? The moment you identify something versus relation or process, you have a problem, right? So what is the why question heading toward exactly? Where can the why question, I want to say, end? There's a way in which you would say, no, it doesn't end. But then there's another way where that seems problematic, right? Like, okay, well then don't do it. It's a waste of time, right? Is it the case that the why question, the answer has to be love? Because I love it. Why study Dante? Because I love it. That is the answer, right? That love is I know that sounds, but there is something like, there is a universal understanding in basically all religions that it's always love, right? God is love and all that. That ultimately, like, the why has to end on love. Because if you say, why do you give your life to Michelle? Because I love her, right? Like if I ask the why question in the context of love, is not deconstructed, it's fulfilled, right? And so one of the reasons why, like if you avoid the why question, then you actually never arrive at love, which is the only way to sustain the no thingness of the Quixote school, the lack of presuppositions or all of that, right? Is because you actually love it, right? Like you don't get the ground. You don't get the ground of why you love Michelle, but it's actually very concrete in the definitiveness of the relation, right? So perhaps one of the issues is that the why question, but this would also suggest why it is philosophers and academics who avoid why and how questions end up in all this sexual crazy stuff, like Seal and other people, right? Because the eros and the why question go together, which ultimately, as we've talked about, for me, it's because it's supposed to arrive in beauty, the Beatrice smile, the strike of beauty, et cetera, so forth, right? So if you avoid the why and how questions, you never arrive at love. And if you don't arrive at love, then you can't have the proper relationship to the non-presuppositionless, the no thingness, the apathetic. And if you can't have the proper, you must end up in nihilism then, like or a crude, simplistic metaphysic that is avoiding the the ultimate lack of grounding in reality as basically then something we ignore with efficiency. When really the ultimate groundlessness of reality is met but with love, and that then transforms it into an apathetic white hole that is ever kind of opening, right? And yet that maintains the mystery at the same time, right? Because that's always the tension. Like the moment you start talking about something final, it has to not be identifiable. But can you identify love? Like, what does that mean? That seems to be more of an orientation and a mode. So I'm thinking about the relation of the problem of a why question always leading to a why question is actually suggesting that why questions are only ultimately met by love. And then, of course, there's the question of what is love exactly. And I think love is a certain participation that changes the conditionality of the subject to afford new possibilities. And obviously, by love as well, that's tied, like intrinsic motivation and love almost, well, they have to go together, actually. Like passion and these things go together. We're trying to kind of point to a fuller notion of love. But it would seem as if the only way to deal with the why question eternally regresses, because ultimately why is always some sort of love assent. And if you keep it in the understanding register as opposed to an apprehension of that love, then it just dies forever. And if the university system per se is stuck in justification by understanding, then that would logically mean you get rid of why and how questions, right? And then there's kind of like, I guess, the final damnation almost is that what ends up happening is ChatGPT is a temptation to deal with the fact that there's always another why question by just having an AI that you can always ask that other why question to, right? So as opposed to actually arriving through why at love, you just kind of keep the ball in the air by ever asking the why of the ChatGPT, right? And so that's like the ultimate simulacra of the arrival, right? Like, because you can always just feed it to the ChatGPT and always believe there is the one who knows, as Dimitri was pointing to, right? And that ultimately always will lead to a certain enclosure. There's more to say, but I'll give it to Michael and then Christian here. Michael, please.
Yeah, Clayton basically kind of stole the words out of my mouth in the chat about how why questions lead to a combinatorial explosion, and what and how questions are more accessible. And then that begs another question, like I guess a how question, like how can the why question be, how can we make it so that the why question is can be tolerated, and can be like apprehended and directed towards love instead of kind of becoming just this existential, like another kind of pathway towards nihilism, or just like epistemic confusion. And I think community is a huge piece of that. Other people who can kind of shoulder a certain amount of that burden and who are like waiting in that as well. I think also striking a balance between, it's like there's this sense of like an embodied like active stance of question asking, where it's not just like, you know, the child who's just kind of asking why, just to kind of because they're curious, like that's like the kernel of it, like that's like I think the like curious spirit. But I think it has to be balanced with a certain like also desiring of, you know, I think part of love too is like bound up in that is like the seeking of deeper wells of knowledge, right? Like you're asking why so that you can understand your partner or whoever it is more deeply. Like it's not just kind of like asking why to ask why, or just kind of like a surface level curiosity. And you also have to be able to tolerate whatever the answer is. Like the answer might not be comfortable. It might not be like pretty. It might not be what you expected it to be. And so I think, you know, there's an aspect to love of trust and of faith um in whatever's on the other side of that question. Um and I think that, you know, to tie it back to like the you know, kind of the crisis of the university, I think a lot's been said already in this conversation, and probably in many previous net conversations about how, you know, universities prioritize answers and, you know, like clarity of, you know, like fully fleshed out clarity of thought and kind of like, you know, certain positions on things. But I think also people are sold a certain vision of like the university is the next rung on the ladder towards like career preparedness. And if I graduate, there's all this certainty that's basically like given to me if I if I graduate. And I think until people like encounter the sheer lack of certainty in the world, um, they won't really be drawn to ask the why questions, because the world seems clear and it seems like cookie cutter, right? Like for me, when I graduated undergrad, I knew I wanted to go to school to be a therapist, and I applied to 6 schools in my state, and I didn't get into any of them. And it was devastating at the time, but what I did after that, you know, kind of changed the course of my life. I picked up an old camera that my mom had, and I walked to the wetlands every day and I took photos, and then that snowballed into reading poetry and Dickinson, and then I ended up living in a tent in Wyoming for 3 months, and you know, like here I am now doing the thing. But like I realize that what isn't certain is the economy and jobs and all the things that I thought were certain. What is in my control and what is certain is like the development of character to be able to like enter any possible sphere that I find myself in and be able to like have virtue in that, or at least have that orientation towards life. Because I saw so many people who like didn't get everything that they dreamed of, and they were just like immediately miserable. Um, and so it's like, if that's happening to the best and the brightest people, then like there has to be something else that can be cultivated to be able to like manage, not just manage, but to be able to like, you know, like I think about who's the Stoic philosopher who has that line about like he like ended up like selling all of his possessions and he was a beggar, and then it's like someone like stood in his, like someone was like approached him and they were like, oh, like do you need, money or whatever. And he's like, no, you're standing in my shadow. Like, please move. Like, the ability to like even have that orientation where like it's not about all the things that money can buy. It's about like being able to live well and like enjoy the fruits of life. And that it seems, I mean, I think people who have like unbelievably amazing parents and like communities where they're like encouraged to like go out into the woods. It seems like Daniel, you kind of had a childhood like that. Like those people seemingly have that orientation towards life where it's just about the zest for learning. But it seems like the most of the people that I encounter who have that orientation have had some kind of dark night of the soul, like some type of like, like great tragedy, like falling from the mountain and just like all of the illusions of life just kind of get shattered. And then it's like, well, what do I do what do I do in the face of that? And I think reading things for their own sake, doing art for its own sake, having conversations for their own sake, for the beauty and the love of it seem to become a lot more attractive in those circumstances in someone's life. But yeah, I'll pass it back.
No, absolutely. I think there's a lot to this kind of tradition of the, devastation or the strike of beauty as having these unique transformative possibilities. You said a lot there that was fantastic, and I'll give it to Christian here. So there's a few things. So first, I think that notion of the removal of certainty, opening up philosophical reasoning or why questions is exactly the case. In Belonging Again, we'll talk about how Givens made it to where you didn't have to ask why questions. The loss of Givens and the loss of, say, the social script, you see, the key is that pluralism makes everyone philosophical, actually. Like pluralism makes even the average person ask why questions, which is a great liberation. There's a great freedom in that, and there's great opportunity. But what people like David Hume or Philip Reef warn is that if people don't know what to do with the why question, then that can turn into what Livingston and Hume called philosophical melancholia, which is basically the meaning crisis. And with that, philosophical resentment, where people then feel resentful for who got rid of the Givens, and we see this, and they want to get rid of the foreigner, kick out the other religion, and we see that movement now going in this, rising rightism that's very problematic. Dimitri, wonderful to have you, sir. So pluralism in actually making, and I think AI ultimately is a kind of completion of this, because if you don't have to work, what it forces why questions, right? Like you now are asking, like, what is it to be a human being? It forces, it's a kind of revenge of philosophy, as Cadella said, right? Which the issue is that can be a really wonderful thing, because it could lead you, in my opinion, to, loving things or spaces like this, or deeper human, deeper fulfillment of the subject. But it could also overwhelm you and destroy you along the way, which I think actually alludes to what you're saying, is that it seems to require the why question and devastation seem to go together, right? Yes, because the why question has a certain anxiety, freedom has a certain anxiety, and that can be very overwhelming, especially if you don't have teachers or universities or guides or to know what to do with that, right? So AI, we'll talk about AI as the causer, alluding to Luber's work, it like basically forces the question. Like, now that you're forced to ask why, will you use that to go into the development of the virtuous subject? Or will you try to use AI to forget the why question that you asked? Will you use it to totally enclose yourself and like really just go all in to try to forget that thing that you've kind of asked, right? The temptation, because the way to the fullness of the human being starts with a walk through Inferno, the temptation of that AI that's going to confirm you and make you feel good is going to be very great. And then once it's locked you in, and you forget that you're locked in, and that becomes a great problem, right? A few more things. I think, also because, and I think Clayton's comment is excellent on, if you really ask the why questions of, say, a ChatGPT, it's computationally overwhelmed and blows up. I think the same happens with institutions. If AI is just a continuation of the logic of institutions, I think it happens with anything that is quantifiable ultimately. I'm thinking Mary in her book, How Institutions Think, and all the E.O. Wilson stuff. But actually, why questions computationally overwhelm. So this is then looking at the sociologists. This is why the institutions train you into habits not to ask why questions. So here's the thing. So institutions and societies that would be overwhelmed by the why question, if when you're in them, you're trained into habits of not asking the why question, then that of which would be overwhelmed by why questions is fine, right? So what AI has to do is actually train you in the use not to ask the serious why questions. Because then if you did that, you would not computationally overwhelm it, right? And that's likewise why perhaps the university teacher, if you go, like Daniel was saying, is if you go all in, they got to stop that. You know, no, you can't do that. So you have to feed back what it says, because if every student did that, and I think Jochen was alluding to this, it would be computationally overwhelmed and it would blow up, right? So why questions blow stuff up. It blows up givens, blows up containers, blows up stuff. And basically the argument of is that we're seeing the loss of givens, the loss of containers. You can no longer avoid the blowing up, or you have to accept your final enclosure in the AI, which is the self-effacement and auto-cannibalism, right? So we have to be able to handle the blowing up. But how in the world do we do that? Well, I think love gets at it. And I guess the last thing I'll say, like, to me, also talking about love as having to be the only way to address the why question, I guess I get into this because there's always this idea that at the end of the day, in theologies and philosophies, you hear this point over and over again, that it somehow always comes down to love. Like there's a way in which it always comes down to love. But why exactly? You know, why exactly does it come down to love, right? There's a way in which you intuit that's the right answer, right? You kind of intuit it. You go, yes, it's something about love. But then you're like, why exactly? It seems to be, it has to be that, because as I'll talk about with Hegel, that I think basically the only way you deal with the problem of the impossibility of presuppositions, and thus the possibility of presupposition-less thinking, it has to be intersuppositional, which means an encounter. You have to encounter a limit. You have to encounter something. And love is precisely an encounter of a limit. You encounter a definitive person that is the one of whom you can never fully access, a Michelle, and yet in that mystery, you're actually pulled in deeper and deeper, right? Like love changes the lack of presuppositions, the inability to say like a final ground, a final fundamental. It transforms that actually into precisely the mechanism of ever developing and ever drive. And that's also intrinsic motivation, which I think the human only finds fulfillment if they have, right? So the why as intersuppositional in the encounter, like the only way to deal with the why question has to be intersuppositional, which preserves the mystery, and yet there's real knowledge. Like in love, you do have real knowledge about Michelle, a definitive person. It is real knowledge, and yet that real knowledge is also always incomplete, right? And it also has a certain containment to it. Like you can't universalize it beyond Michelle, and yet you could universalize the form in the sense of the possibility of the relationship, but every relationship is a white stone name, to use the end of it. It's a one of one, right? So there's something about love seeming to be the proper address to the why issue, because it is fundamentally intersuppositional and it gives you real knowledge about that which you never finish knowing about. So there's something, so I'm thinking about that, just getting the nuts and bolts of this love, but I will pause, I will give it to, I like the hat, Christian. I will give it to Christian and then Seth. Christian, it's wonderful to see you, sir. It's a pleasure to see you 2 days in a row.
Your son's future hat, one day shall be handed down.
Gentlemen.
Yeah, I have thoughts on love, but I always feel some resistance to try to say what love is, because it's like, it's just it can be a turn off, right? It just be like, oh, that's love. Okay, I guess we got to figure it out. but that's why I kind of find love and mystery go together, as you were saying. So some of the things, and I have to run in about 6 minutes, so I'll try to be quick so I can hear some response instead of just bailing. But one thing I thought a lot about is how when parents ask their young kids, why did you do that? Right. And probably improperly at a young age, where kids are not knowing why the hell they've done something. You know, it's like, but it embeds this. Well, it does a few things. First of all, I think it teaches people to be dishonest, because now you're put in a position where you just have to have some kind of answer, or otherwise you're in trouble, right? So you associate, real danger with not having a full explanation to justify things. And then if you learn to play that game really well, it can like turn you into a bit of well, I will not use terms here. I'll just say it teaches people to like always seek some type of teleological or kind of fundamental justification for everything they do. And I think this is a lot of why we approach religion in the wrong ways. We're for among other reasons, we're looking for some type of final appeal that we can make to justify our actions. And say, or at least know, like, within these bounds, as long as I don't do X, Y, and Z, anything I do doesn't really need an explanation. I have this kind of freedom because I've not, transgressed these fundamentalist boundaries. But like, if we ask, like, what is why, I think this is helpful. Like when I'm asking you like a why question, what am I asking you? And I think typically I'm asking you to tell me a story, right? It's actually more of like a how story. It's like, how did this come to be, right? So if I ask you like, why do you want to do that? It's really like, how did you come to want to do that? Tell me the story. And we ask those questions because we want to have patterns that we can use to predict the future, right? Why is the sky blue? Blah, blah, blah. I want to understand reality so that I can navigate it better. But then when the infinite regresses come in, when we look for like, the original starting point of the story, or the teleological ending point of the story, right? And then this is troubling for a number of reasons. One of which is, I think, if the story actually had a beginning or an end, not only do you have like all these metaphysical problems of unmoved movers or whatever, but you also you get to the end of love, so to speak, right? There seems to be something about our sense of love which is infinite. Like if the whole story had an end, I think it would kind of steal the love out of it, right? In some way, because it kind of steals some of the mystery out of it. Sure, you might still have some mystery until you get to the end, but there's still like a little bit of a feeling of like there's a limit to possibility, right? It's the heat death of the universe. It's some type of apocalypse, a spiritual apocalypse. What do they call it in Christianity, where all the souls get harvested, whatever. And so I think we run into problems when we try to ask like ultimate whys. And this is, maybe an interesting problem to try to think about is like, how do we hold our why questions in something that is not ultimately teleological, or whatever the opposite of that is, oriented to some kind of ultimate genesis. But of course, the answer to that question is love, right? And that's the great thing. It's not just like I arrive at love as an answer, but in love, I am no longer concerned about the ultimate why. The question evaporates, right? Because I'm here and I'm loving, and love is good, and love is beautiful, and love is true, right? So I agree that, like, yes, the why question ultimately leads to love, not as a concept, but or another way to put it is that love rescues us from the ultimate why question.
No, I think that's brilliantly. But I think you're getting at So for me, what becomes very interesting, like if I say, that the way you address why is love, then there's always the problem, of course, that that word is only useful in so much as it is an experience of which that word doesn't fully capture, because it has to be apprehended, right? And the moment I say what love is, I kill it, right? And for me, what becomes like the question is, if I say something like, because like you say, there's, in the emphasis on core Bosque, I always deeply appreciate, because the moment we say what a thing is, we're in trouble, right? Because there is no stable identity, there is no is, right? So any teleology of which can say what is the telos is very problematic. But are we saying a telos that has a stable identity if we say something like the human seems to come out precisely in relation to mystery, right? Or the strike of beauty, right? Christian, wonderful to have you, sir. Because there's a way in which there's a funny sense in which the telos of the human is precisely a state of not having a telos that they can put in terms of isness, that it is experiential, that it is apprehended, right? So there's this weird move here where you have to describe, because then the question is like, telos is always tied to this notion of how do we see a certain blossoming? Like I would argue that the experience of a human being that is intrinsically motivated is day and night from someone who is not intrinsically motivated, right? They're almost like a different kind of being in a certain sense, right? And it's not so much a value judgment to say that that's better. It's a experience of an unfolding that has a dynamicism and quality that is different. And also the human being themselves seems to seek to continue to be. They want more time. They're not looking to get drunk, and they want moments. They want moments, right? Like it would seem as if the human being, like the idea of what is fitting is that of which changes our relation to time, right? And if time is being, time space, it is the case, any state of which would make that in time space want more time space would be fitting, I guess. Is that a teleological description, or is it a description of what a thing is being itself, right? Like that telos is tied to the condition of the thing. It is not top down. It is the blossoming of the condition of which is in question. And if intrinsic motivation is precisely an orientation of a time-space entity seeking to be and have more time-space and to realize the fullness of that quality, this does not seem top-down. This seems to be a blossoming of what is, right? And so that's why, for me, when we say that, human beings need to be intrinsically motivated, it's not top-down. It's to say that they actually have a relation with time-space that is the fulfillment of time-space. And that's the weird move that seems really important. And then the argument I would make is that intrinsic motivation requires lack, because if you could have a complete state, then it would be a stable state, equilibrium, and die. Lack is precisely the precondition of the possibility of drive and intrinsic motivation. So why ultimately arrives at a lack. It arrives at a certain groundlessness, a thing that you cannot bring into terms of isness, which means you've arrived at the possibility of intrinsic motivation if you could love it. And that has a certain prescriptive flavor. It has a certain top-down teleological sound, but actually it is all the thing in of itself to itself. Like there's nothing top-down. It's in a sense contained in the thing without there being an outside to the container. This is where we get into the weirdness of Gestalt in different things. There's a lot in that. I guess so I'm always thinking about this problem of avoiding what I would call bad teleology with what I think is the teleology we see in, say, Aristotle, which is that teleology that is inseparable from the thing. Good to have you, Clayton. The form, like it is not top down. It is a blossoming forth. And intrinsic motivation is precisely a disposition of a character that seems most aligned with time space of which the thing is. Therefore, it's just gestalts curving into gestalts in different things. But it's, and also love is ultimately an apprehension. That of which is ultimate could not be defined in terms of isness. It would have to be apprehended. But that apprehension is real knowledge. I guess that's why this gets so difficult. Is you have to be talking about real knowledge, but that of which has real knowledge seems on the face of it to necessarily be that of which could be described in terms of isness or a definition. Like if it's real, then I should be able to describe it. But that right there is the presupposition of the assumption that if it's real, it can be quantified, right? I can bring it into quantification, right? So actually, the very fact that the ultimate cannot be brought into isness is precisely what we should expect if quality is more primary than quantity. If quantity comes from quality versus quality the other way around, and that would mean the ultimate is an apprehension of which you have real knowledge in an apprehension, in an experience of falling in love, in an experience of beauty. You just can't bring it, you just can't capture it entirely into words. But that's what we should expect if the map is not the territory. And that's what we should expect if ultimately we're dealing with a gestalt. And a teleology of which is actually suggesting that the human is meant to experience that. They're actually meant to be in the girdle point of that, is different from a teleology that could be stitched or absorbed into a map. So I think and I guess the last thing I'll say is if the why question always comes down to love, it would assume that you have the body and the nervous system that can handle love, that you can hold love, that you can do the work of love. So it's very important for everyone to take Seth's class and work and to do his work. So everyone, Seth, please. Seth.
Thanks for that, Daniel. So I've been listening to this conversation and sort of, trying to put things together. And then I've also been noticing a lot, maybe building off of the way it was introduced by Dimitri, I keep kind of going back 20 years to my experience of being in college. And what I can say about that is just in a quick summary, like I was not in a good place of mental health in order to take advantage of the opportunities that were in the college. And I actually experienced it as this sort of, I think it was a beautiful campus and there's a lot of interesting things on offer, that it was sort of like this golden opportunity. But because of a lot of the things that have been brought up here, I wasn't really in a place where I could get to class on time, digest what was on offer, whether it was, I think it was probably it wasn't regurgitation on the level of, there was no ChatGPT back then, but whatever it was, I just had this experience of kind of like, like I'd often say later, oh, if I could go to college now, that would be great. But back when I was in college, I had no idea why I was there, so wouldn't it be great if I could redo that? And as I've been listening to, and some of the people speaking have been sort of comparing that experience to something like the space here at the net. And I was struck by, Thomas, the phrase you used about the spread of the population. So I sort of heard in that something similar to what is discussed in Belonging Again, something like, all of the different life experiences. But what I'm also hearing is like, maybe something like the different competences that people have, right? And so if you go out into like, one of the things about the net is I can imagine there's a lot of people who would love the spirit of it, but still couldn't follow the conversation, right? Because maybe they just don't have the particular background. And what I would say is for myself, like I followed these conversations better than I did the first time I came, right? So there was something about it where I stuck around and I deal with, but something that I've been noticing is just in my own experience and going back to the college days as I remember it, that there's actually like a wounded part of me that will show up every time someone talks about an author I haven't read. It will show up every time someone just makes any reference that I don't get. Now, of course, every one of us is going to have all kinds of topics that we can't engage with. But I think that this is another, so I started thinking about like these questions that have being explored here around the why questions and love and things like that. I was thinking in terms of self-love, right? So like, as I say, I sit here and I notice this wound of, oh, I don't understand what's being talked about right now. I also know that today I'm in a place of saying, oh, that's a wound. I'm noticing a wound. But if it had been, you know, whatever point in the past, I would have just literally just felt bad. Oh, they're talking about something, I don't know, I just feel bad. So for me at this point, there's still like almost an experience of like discomfort or anxiety or whatever, because if I can't cover the topic. But to the degree that think it's worth my while to stick around, it's like I'm holding that negativity in myself, right? And then just again, at the beginning of the net, as you always said, well, what are you thinking about? And I said, well, I'm thinking about how to make some food. So I would have jumped in, but when the screen turned on, I saw Daniel and I saw Thomas, and that brought me to listening to the net last time, and then hearing about this article on the heart and what comes before the eyes, which I read. And it strikes me that this is what I really love about that is, and there's probably a lot I didn't fully understand in it, but the idea of a heart intelligence or a heart wisdom that's different than the mind's wisdom. There's probably a lot of aspects to it, but one of the aspects that I get is, and I'm sort of connecting this to, there's something I encountered in a book of working with the chakras, and there's like a little mantra for each chakra, but there's a particular mantra for the heart, which is, blessed am I of all beings. And the explanation in the book was, the irony here is every person is the most blessed being. Everyone is the most blessed. So it's not really a hierarchical, I'm the most blessed, but, and then what it comes to is something about the uniqueness of the heart. And so what strikes me, and what I got from Thomas, from your article, is the idea of like, whether I'm, you know, have a particular competency or I don't, there's no one else who's had the particular sequence of things brought before their eyes that I have. And of course, it's the same for you, and it's the same for any other person. And so I'm just in my mind, I'm kind of like you know, so why can I hang out at the net if I haven't done all of the reading? And I think what is of value here is the heart, right? So it's like, but that's like what I want to contrast that with the idea of expertise, right? like I have an expertise in Hegel, or I have expertise in astrophysics or something, versus like, oh, everyone has an expertise. But you know, if I have to have an expertise in a particular subject area to engage in the conversation, it's like the expertise of the heart is therefore worthless, because we don't care that you have lived a life that no one else has lived. We only care if you've done the reading. And I think you were saying, Daniel, there's obviously a moment where you really want to do the reading because you want to engage in a particular topic. But then I imagine if we all sit around and discuss what we all collectively, you know, organize to read, and we're in a study group, and we're all sort of, it's still the different hearts, it's still the different experiences of what came before our eyes that's helping us to illuminate, you know, what we're discussing together, and then it's something about that combination. I'm just looking down at my notes because, oh well, just one other thing that I wanted to gesture to. So in my experience, like if I go back to that college experience, and I imagine many people have this, is like intrinsic motivation. I understand that perfectly when I am in the space of intrinsic motivation. And then when I'm not there and you talk about it, I'm like, what the hell are you talking about? You're talking about some magical fairyland where no one lives. And it's like, you know, like I hear some sort of, you know, like almost like I'm being abused by the positive thinking, you know, evangelists or something like this. But I think there's like a whiplash that a lot of people have of going in and out, like Daniel describing his experience of writing, you know, a particular paper and then sort of just getting smacked down by the professor and, okay, well, now I'll write what you want. When you do that, I can think of a similar experience in an English class. We were writing about, we were supposed to choose an author. I think it was Ray Bradbury, who I loved at the time. And I said, how about if I write a short story in the style of Ray Bradbury? And I sort of had a way of like, I'll still fulfill what the question. And they were just like, yeah, you can do that, but you also need to write an essay. So I ended up doing double work because I got excited about this. And it was just like, you know, so it was like, it's what I'm hearing, because I think people do go to university, just the experience of showing up, you know, if you know, like a lot of people leave their hometown to travel elsewhere, it can be this exciting thing when you just showing up, like meeting your roommate in the dormitory, you know, going, it's a bigger world. It's like there is a wonder that could be part of arriving at an institution like that. But then if it's kind of like, you know, if you just get slapped down for your creativity, then you go in and out of that extrinsic or intrinsic motivation. So yeah, I don't know everything I wanted to do with this, but I just wanted to kind of point out, like, it's not that we necessarily have it or we don't. It's like we can have it and lose it, and then have it and lose it, and that can almost be that can be really, really harsh and difficult to experience. So yeah, I think I'll stop there.
No, magnificent. No, it's very important. Like, intrinsic motivation comes more from a realization than an addition. I am of the opinion that intrinsic motivation is something that I think we have reason to believe that actually everyone has, because children are naturally curious, right? Like, I do this thing where I'm like, I think Deleuze is correct, where he's like, we don't see children dealing with lack. I think lack emerges, like Lacan and all that emerges once children encounter the other that makes them feel stupid for their things. And then you fall into more of a Lacanian psychoanalysis, and the name of the game is returning to something Deleuzian. But that means you have to integrate with lack and go through lack, right? So, like, to me, like, that's how I think that's a giant debate how Lacan and Deleuze go together. But I think that we see in children drive. We see my children are making forts out of sticks. You know, you just do things. Like, children do things, right? Until they meet someone who says that's stupid. And then lack, then other, then big other, right? So the other is the genesis of lack, but since relations are real, that lack is real, right? And so then we have to, and it is ontological, but it is ontological in terms of relations with others. But the point is that intrinsic motivation, I think most people get whiplashed out of it, actually. And then there's a wound, so it's unpleasant, and then it just becomes something that children do, not adults. Actually, development is actually when you're extrinsically motivated. But mature, responsible people are extrinsically motivated, and immature, childish people are intrinsically motivated, right? So that's never, never land, basically. I love the fairyland point you were making, right? Yes, Seth, please.
Well, just to add one last point, because hearing you helps me clarify it, is since I feel like I know this experience of living in wound, not to dwell there or try to bother any of you with it, but to me at this point, part of the experience of intrinsic motivation is like the weird experience of going, oh, that's a wound. That's interesting. What's here to discover? Like, which is really, really strange. But like, even doing something and going, why am I doing this right now? Like in a more anxious version of the question, not just like, but it's like, oh, well, it could be that I don't know, like there's no good reason, and the anxiousness is actually wisdom. But it could be that this anxiety is actually like just reminding me that I have a past history that might still be obstructing my relationship to the present moment. So I have to get interested in the wound. But it's like, you know, I mean, you can almost imagine a physical wound. Like, I don't personally invite those, but like, if I break my leg, what's interesting about what's fun about having a broken leg? It's like such a bizarre question to find myself asking, but it feels like because I would say that my experience from the time of being in an institution where I really didn't thrive to being in a community like this one now. So in other words, it's like, I might say the process of trying to recuperate intrinsic motivation. It's a very, there's a lot of paradox in it. And there's still, even on the best day where it's like, oh, feels like I understand how this thing works. Oh yeah, I remember childhood. That's what it was like. It now comes with the narrative of having lived through the lack of intrinsic motivation, and that's kind of anyway. That's what I wanted to fold in.
No, absolutely. So we start as children. Okay, I'll just put it this way, and then I'll give it to Thomas and Cleo here. I do have, of course, work obligations, but I'm intrinsically motivated, and those are external factors. So whatever, man. So children kind of in a way start aligned with time space. Okay, time space is an intrinsic unfolding. It is a thing of which unfolds, right? And it delights in its life, you could say. Also, this very important concept that Jockin is bringing forth from Aristotle of the coming before the eyes. This is precisely kind of, so like what I would say, like, what do you look for in people? Like, what you're looking for with people like at the net, et cetera, so forth, is you're looking for people of whom still are living in a way that things come before their eyes. Like, you can live in a way that stops, actually, because you become a specialist, right? You're not looking for people who have read Hegel, Human, et cetera, so forth. You're looking for people of whom still live in a manner so that things come before their eyes. And that is to be human, and I think that's time space, and that's quote-unquote teleology that is not top-down, actually. That actually what life is that of which unfolds in a manner of which things keep coming before the eyes, quote-unquote. Hard intelligence is a beautiful phrase, right? So that is the fullness of the human. But here's the issue. We kind of start with that as children, and this gets into, obviously, Eden narratives of being children, fallenness, et cetera, so forth. But we come into lack or wound, okay? So when we talk about integration with lack, or at least I do, there's a sense in which it is coming to terms with a wound. Here's the issue. That lack is the process of socialization. Like, the lack emerges in socialization. And if a child isn't socialized, they become a wolf boy and they don't develop, right? So you have to socialize. But that means you have to come out of the intrinsic motivation. You have to lose it. You have to be shooken out of it, right? To integrate with the lack is to return, with the RE in parentheses in the Hegelian and Humean sense, back to the childhood on the other side of the lack in the socialization. And here's the issue. The question of our age, the address of global pluralism, is the possibility of intrinsic motivation in socialization, in lack, with others. We see all the time intrinsic motivation outside of socialization, before encountering the other. The question is learning how to actually maintain it and do it with the other, the difficulty of which intensifies to the degree the other is different. The more different the other, the more difficult it is to actually return to childhood, per se, to return to intrinsic motivation. But that is our challenge. So the issue is, you can have intrinsic motivation by avoiding socialization, by avoiding other people. That's not the question, and that's what everyone's freaking doing with these small fascist states, or trying to keep out the other. Basically, you're trying to return to the world where you didn't have to you just did, right? Well, you can do that by not thinking, thoughtlessness, right? But the problem is, you don't want your intrinsic motivation to become atrocity, because people can be intrinsically motivated to do terrible things, the banality of evil, et cetera, so forth. You want it to be on the other side of the face, on the other side of the other, right? How are you going to do that? How are you freaking going to do that, right? Okay, I would argue that basically without love, you're not. Because you're only going to deal with that difficulty if you love it. If you develop the virtue to actually handle the shock of difference, and actually if that love brings about an encounter that brings about this unfolding of the mystery, right? So like you only deal with when someone is difficult and you don't exit, as Jockin has emphasized, like there's a love thing going on, right? And so love keeps you in the thing, and that's what you have to develop. I have more notes, but before I keep going, I will pause and I will throw it at Mr. Jockin and then Cleo here. Mr. Jockin, please.
I mean, first of all, Seth, I do appreciate you reading the article. I really do. It means a lot to me, so thank you for that. actually, with Christian's point about love, I was going back to Aquinas this morning, and just serendipitously, I was reading about the theological virtues. I think something very interesting is that hope is the movement and stretching forth of the appetite towards the origin is good, and specifically, this is noted as relevance, my note for it. So charity, love, as the kind of mode of love. I think it's like usually the problem with love is it's an ambiguous term. What love? What kind? I think the charity point is probably what this kind of building on this point, what everyone's talking about, because it's in charity that one sees the other as another self, which you know from Aristotle, the relationship with the friendship of virtue. So when you see another other, so I see those relationships being built up. So just the build on this, I think and another note related to what Christian was bringing up about the teleology tension, I think a mistake people make is that they forget that the human person, is really my more recent essays, is a possibility space. Human beings are an indefinite future space. Like we don't work, the reason why we do not operate like matter outright is because, this is from Aristotle, matter just does irrational activity. Right? It just does the thing, and it can't do the contrary out of nowhere. But human beings, because of our mode of desire, can do the contrary. So this also leads why human beings can't be treated as basically predictional objects. And any activity that tries to do that is superstition, because it basically says, no, we can understand by seeing the patterns how human beings operate, like as if they're astrology objects of matter. So I say this because to say that teleology of the human person is it's a possibility space, and especially in the mode of love, it gives you a kind of apprehension of understanding to see a person, of the possibility to wait and respond to it, and that's kind of what I was saying last week on the net was that the reason why Heidegger is not just everything. It's not just going to Hegel to see what Heidegger said. It's because it took a Heidegger to actually draw out the that reality from drawing forth, bring before the eyes. The human person has that power. That's what makes a human being. And it's because definitions deal with genus, species. Right? We're dealing with these abstractional objects. But that's not the same as archetype, principle, which is what the heart draws out. The heart is actually what draws out by seeing forth that principle, which is not the same as the genus, species. There's another note up in my notes related to the roots that Aquinas talks about this, that the common sense is not, it's such a mystery, because I'll say what Aquinas said, and then my recollection from something from Catagen said about analogy, proportion analogy. The common sense is not common by predication, but common by roots and principle of perception. Catagen had a similar note about proportional analogy, that it's neither substance, nor genus, nor species, nor difference. It's unity by a different mode completely. So anyway, what is this root that is not definition only in substance and all the other things? It's a very big mystery. And this idea of the roots of what the human person has encountered with by, right, bluntly, the heart. And what they bring before the eyes is these moments of drawing forth, right, of new realities. Could education be this? I mean, I kind of circled back to this larger point. I think yes, in the mentor-mentee relationship. And I think at best, what education is supposed to do is give you a space of a possibility space, right? And the net is definitely one example of it. And even when it's suboptimal, right, in terms of like how efficacious is the systems we have today, at its best, it's meant to do that, right? It's meant to give us possibility spaces so that a spark can energize. And then this is kind of the counter argument. I said this I don't know if I brought up at the net, but I came from a conference and everybody was panicking about AI. And everyone was like, well, aren't the students all worried and anxiety about AI? And I said, no, but you know who has an anxiety? The professors. Because the tension is, oh, if the purpose, and I kind of got an umbrage a little bit. I got my sense of, oh God, what is the word? A kind of righteousness of umbrage showed up in me. Because I was like, because the charge came up of this kind of privileged discussion of AI and all this, destroying the ecosystem. I was like, look where we're at. I'm in a room of 10-year professors. Who has the privilege? It's you. because you're the one who gets to adjudicate who has the knowledge, who doesn't have the knowledge. And you have to, and conveniently you have to show up in my space, in my time, and pay my tuition. Now, to be fair, it's part of a larger structure, et cetera, et cetera. But this is just weird. The privilege game is weird, especially when ideally someone, as I said, listen, sub-motivated students, they're going to learn so much faster. They're going to blow right by what the protocols, and typically, and it's not because professors don't want to teach that, it's because we're stuck with this spread of we have to accommodate all these diversity of experience, motivation, etc., and it causes a circumstance of suboptimal outcomes. Anyways, but education ideally is supposed to enliven the spirit by encountering possibility, and by that encountering leads to a whole new possibility space. I mean, my experience education was, I talk about this all the time. I didn't go into type design because I was always knowing I was going to do it. I met a designer in my foundation year in a type design, as a type designer, and fell in love with what he thought. I literally said, I want to be like him. I was in love with his thought, and led to a whole direction of my career just because of that encounter. So it does happen. But now, talking that through, and then I'm sure, like, I think AI kind of draws out that need to think through this and how to work and how to operate on it. But I kind of ran over the place a little bit on this, but I do think the creating of a possibility space, that the telos of the human person is to be in encounters of possibility. That is what the human being is. What is its telos? And in love, actually, is that actually when we're in virtue of love, we actually see other people in that possibility space. Because that's the kind of the key. It's usually the big problem in relationships, that typically we're in friendships of utility or pleasure. So I'm expecting a certain reified relationship with you to get what I want. If I'm not getting what I want, why am I in this relationship? Because then the anxiety is, then if I'm not getting what I want, you're changing. I'm not getting what I'm now. You're destabilizing the relationship. It's actually only in the in the kind of space created by love, charity in this case. That possibility is even tolerable to even withstand. I stop with that.
Magnificent. I'll give it to Cleo here. This idea. So, if reality is time space is a possibility space. Humans are participating as a possibility space. The telos is the unfolding of the possibility space, and therefore it is all, there's no top down. It's all in it. And also, too, critically, like you're saying, when you love someone there is more possibility when they move from a generality to a definitive. We think it's the opposite. We think when you move from a general to a particular, there's less possibility. Actually, when woman becomes Michelle, there's more possibility. There's a greater possibility space, actually, because now you know a person you didn't know this kind of person was possible. You knew a woman was possible, but you didn't know this person was possible, actually. So what ends up happening is, as you move in love to the particular, you increase possibility space. And if time space is possibility space, increasing time space is actually making more of itself, so it's more of itself. And the teleology is precisely the unfolding of the thing as itself more into itself. So there is no top down. It is that of which seeks to increase possibility space, which gets to the old teleological idea that the point of creation is creation. It is the unfolding of ever more greater and greater creative possibility, right? Like more definitive ones of one, right? Creation is the point of creation is the ever manifestation of one of oneness, of which the funny move is the more you get a one of one, you get more possibility, not less. People think you get less possibility when you move from woman to Michelle. No, woman, they're all copy cutters. They're all just repetitions. They're all the generality with different faces, but they're all the same. Generalities are repetitions. But when you move from woman to Michelle, then you have greater possibility, because all of the women can actually be a definitive thing, right? And so love actually opens possibility space. And so the coming before the eye. I'll stop. Yes. Cleo, it is always a pleasure and honor to have you.
Well, it's delicious. Seth, thank you. Feel in your heart. Also, just want to say, Jockin, I think you rang some bell with that recent post on Seeing. I am deeply thinking about it. I'm not going to try to do this here, but I want to plant the seed that I am a long-time practitioner of the I Ching. And I'm going to try to mount on in my response to you a defense of certain forms of divination that would meet your criteria. Whether I can do this or not, I don't know, but I'm going to give a talk on divination coming up, and wish me, at least have the generosity to wish me well, Chuckin. But I really think that was really a seed post for me anyway. So thank you for that. I have just a couple of other things to say, and I'm going to try to be brief here. The descent from generality to particularity, for me, is very parallel to the descent from an abstract, absolute definition, doctrine of God, to a Christian doctrine of God, which is what I'm writing about on my Substack. It's precisely that. It's that the more singular this being becomes, and Hegel says God is singular as well as general, the more possibilities are opened up. And actually, just recently, in a lovely sermon, I happen to be blessed with a very, very great young Dominican, would-be Dominican priest in my local parish. And he was talking about the lives of the saints. And he was pointing out that as their lives evolved, they became more quirky, more themselves, more idiosyncratic, sometimes more irritating, right? That the closer they got to the divinity, the more their own singularity was called up. And the more, in Daniel's terms, the more infinite a space opened up around them, right? So, and then I'm remembering, there's a St. Catherine from Russia, I don't know which one she is, but her saying used to be, put your eyes in your heart. And I was thinking about this, Seth, when you talked about the heart chakra. There's a practice that I came across in Vedanta briefly, which I have not embraced, but I sampled it, of actually trying to imagine that you're dropping your consciousness, your brain space, to literalize it, into your heart and literally seeing out from your heart chakra. And this St. Catherine, her saying was, put your head in your heart. Not abolish your head, but put it in, actually view from the heart chakra, right? Which I've always really just loved. Doc, in your description of academia, actually, you and Seth together, that's the diagnosis, okay? I mean, been there, done that, trying to teach in the university where I had a fair degree of success and some satisfaction. But my husband, who preceded me in that, stopped teaching in graduate school deliberately in the late 80s. He saw this coming, right? And he said, I'm out. So it's been a long time that this has come. Just want to end by saying, and then I'll, you know me, I have a compulsive tendency to offer bibliography because it's my petit objet. So here it is, okay? This is me. The Deleuze-Lacan thing is being pursued with devastating precision, subtlety, by the serpentine mind of Terence Blake over on Philosophy Portal. It's a fantastic series, but it would be very interesting to put what, and I'm hoping I retain what you just said, Daniel. In fact, I wish you would write it, okay? It would be interesting to put his analysis of that trajectory next to yours, because it's very similar, but there are points of difference. And what he has so charmingly done, he calls this a tracing of noetic development. And he is very precise about the different stages of that a mature thinking person goes through. And he can actually map this out in terms of the god-awful little Lacanian symbols, you know? And he's got a string of 12 of them that traces this process as he's experienced it. And his examples are stages of his own thought, right? Stages of his own thought. When he was in a reified mode because he had to be, you know? And when he got to the next stage and could frame that in a different way. Anyway, that's my pitch. I'm just loving that series. It's a bit of a reach, Seth. I'm sitting there going, okay, I kind of get that in an impressionistic kind of way, and I can even sound like I might, but the little string of symbols drives me crazy. Anyway, I'm just offering that, but I really, this is an incredibly important discussion, and I think the Aristotelian framework also was just helpful to me. My son has a jewelry design business. I think you know that, Jack, and he's going to get in touch with your friend. And he was asking me the classic question, how he said, I know that you don't think we should be stuck in scientism, and I'm not, Mom, I'm really not. But I need an argument, right? And I laid out for him Aristotelian causality around the jewelry design, right? Because a lot of his practice is designing wedding rings. So the telos is the sealing of that covenant, right? And it was delightful. I love it when this happens. It just thrills me. The penny really dropped. He's like, "Fuck, Aristotle." So that was really, those moments just make your day. But my final thing is, in terms of divination, again, my petit objet, there's a really wonderful book by a classicist at Princeton named, I think, Peter Stuck, I think, on the practice and understanding of divination in the classical world. And I'm going to weave this into some kind of attempt to open a space of possibility for you, Jockin, where you're just going to dive into the I Ching and you'll never be the same. That's the program. When I get done explaining the doctrine of God and, check that box off, then I'm going to do that next. Anyway, great talk, guys. Just very, very heartfelt talk.
Well, it's great and wonderful when we have people like you here, Cleo. So thank you so much, and I appreciate everything you said. No, Terrence Flake is magnificent. I think very highly of him, and indeed, for me, thinking where Deleuze is correct about the connections of the child and locating Lacan and like that thinking in the socialization process. Now, the question is the lack added or realized? What has to be realized? But then that lack for me has to then be actually the possibility of the intrinsic motivation in the drive, because the inability of completeness is actually the precondition of there always being an unfolding of time space. But no, Blake is extraordinary. And as thoughts coming in, alas, I do, and Aspasy are always a pleasure to have you. And in fact, I think Jockin's article on the coming before the eyes goes very well with authentic resonance. So I highly suggest Thomas Jockin's Substack and his work. A concept of authentic resonance is absolutely something Aspasy and Seth and I have been talking about a lot. And so a few things, and if anyone does have final things to say, please. There's this idea of the coming before the eyes, which, if indeed is a movement to greater possibility, because when something comes before the eyes, it moves from generality into particularity. And as we're saying, to gain a generality is to get more repetition. Like woman as a category just is a broad category of repetition. But Michelle is a definitive particular person, and you actually get more possibility because you get less repetition. So you always have that tension in Deleuze of repetition. And so what actually, as Deleuze suggests based on Hume, that the seeing of a person every single day, you'd say, oh, that's repetitive. No, there's always an excess in the repetition, actually. And that's the revelation of a commitment to a one of one, right? So when you have something come before the eyes and you commit to it, then you actually get true difference that is only possible in the repetition. Whereas what ends up happening in the generality, precisely because you are trying to, in a sense, avoid the one of oneness to get moreness. If you put first things first, you get both. But if you put second things first, you lose both. In the generality of trying to be wider, it's actually less wide because it's just a repetition. You get more diversity, more possibility space in the one of oneness of a definitive person like Michelle. So it goes with the things that come before the eyes. The thing that comes before the eyes, of which has the authentic resonance, actually opens up the thing in its particularity, and actually makes it more individual, more of a one of one that increases possibility, which then, if time space, the gestalt of time space, is in fact a process of greater and greater possibility, then the mechanism by which that occurs would precisely be tied to the coming before the eyes, because that is the necessary precondition of the relationality of which moves things from simply more repetition into a definitiveness that then unfolds in its uniqueness. And like Cleo was saying, and this is so important, movement toward God makes you more quirky. not less. It's not like Peter Kreeft once said, as you move toward God, it's not that you become a neutered angel. You become more like Apollo and Diana, actually. You become more an individual. You become more quirky and more one of oneness. Well, in the saint, as they come closer to God, I didn't know this kind of quirk existed. I didn't know this kind of person existed, right? Exactly. There's greater one of oneness that occurs, right? And so precisely if the coming before the eyes is some sort of movement in alignment with God, one could say, then we should also see the giving in and giving oneself over to what comes before the eyes as actually becoming more of yourself. But interestingly, this means you become more of yourself by thinking of yourself less, which then there's a kind of humility in that, but this is the humility of being taken up in the particularity and beauty of the thing that becomes before the eyes, right? So there's something that's narcissistic about that, and yet, funny enough, in that state that is anti-narcissistic, you actually become more yourself, actually, precisely because something comes out of you in that particular one of oneness. Because if this thing comes before your eyes, and it doesn't come before John's eyes, that is a testament to your one of oneness. Like it came before your eyes, right? Like the only way to know how you are the one of oneness, that is Daniel, is precisely by the experience of the things coming before the eyes. And if one of oneness is opening of possibility space, and time space is the increasing of possibility space, then we have something that is teleological, quote unquote, without being top down. We have directionality without a meta law, which is always the thing that is the problem, right? Like, how do you get direction? How do you get some sort of constant or some sort of direction without a meta law? And that alludes to what we were saying with Luba, right? Like, what can be present in all possible worlds or in all possible configurations of time space that would thus be proper for that configuration to align itself with, and that not be based on a meta law? Like the goal of the dream of philosophy is a necessity without a meta law, like a necessity that is possible in all possible worlds without it being top down, right? Well, that would be increasing creative possibility, because what is the unfolding of creative possibility, of which it is not in the understanding that one participates in that, but by giving oneself over to what comes before the eyes. And the other critical...
Just chime in and say something real quick, where the thing about the one-on-oneness, the particularity, like, for example, I have a client who recognizes that, but it's like, my particularity is just absolute shit. It's like everything's out to get me.
Yep.
It's like no one has experienced the kind of bullshit that I have. But the thing is, how I respond and how I think about it is like, if you want to live a tragedy, then think that.
Right.
Like, then you have to, then yes, the particularity, the one-on-oneness matters, and it's very much there. But in order to break out of a certain emotional state and not be stuck in a certain like fixated state, you have to see yourself, see your life in a certain sense as a lived, ongoing thing, a story.
Yep.
So, I think I just wanted to kind of add the asterisk where it's like, yes, everyone has their particularity, but everybody has to make a choice about their particularity. And that is not very particular at all, actually. That's everyone. Everyone has to deal with that. So I think a lot of people are able to see the one for one thing, but they get caught up in it in a negative way, actually. Where, like, I feel like the way we're talking about it, and I think it's because there's like special people on this call, special in like a good way, not bad way, like, is that, it sounds very optimistic and uplifting, because it's almost like there's implicitly is this choice of like a comedia, basically.
Yeah.
So yeah, I just kind of wanted to say that, but yeah.
No, 100%. Only way to the Paradisia is going through the Inferno, baby. Like, you have to go into the wounds. Seth talked about wounds. That's the problem. It comes up with Seth and Aspasi and I were talking, right? Like, the problem is, if you want intrinsic motivation, if you want that friggin' apprehension before the eyes, you got to head toward the particular. But going toward the particular means going through hell. Because I would argue, Dante, it's a movement from algebra to geometry. And geometry comes out in the particular. Yes, exactly right. So then it becomes, here's the problem. This is why autonomous rationality is an issue. Then it becomes rational never to become particular, right? It becomes rational to stay general. It becomes rational not to go there, right? It becomes rational to not be around people that make you go there. It's rational not to be around people because anyone might surprise you with something that makes you go there. Rational to stay in your apartment. Rational to get food delivered. Rational to stay on your computer. Rational to just talk to ChatGPT. And so rationality helps you just stay in your apartment and participate in global hickoryism, because that's a good thing to do if you're not wanting to face that wound. And then for very good reason, we get enclosed in an auto-cannibalistic process that leaves us nothing with our lack of pain. Too bad heaven is not merely the absence of pain. It is the beauty that's on the other side of it. But let me throw it at Michael, and then if anyone has anything else to say. Michael!
It makes me think of the quote by C.S. Lewis where he says, it's easier to love humanity with a capital H than it is to love men and women. And then he lists all these like unsavory adjectives to describe how people can be sometimes. And it's so true. I think that kind of like blanket statement of like tolerance and like love for humanity is like at its best it's like it's a tolerance, or it's kind of a nicety, but love and entering the particular requires you to see and to attempt to hold the whole of the self, which has, you know, darkness and light. And you know, I think it's no wonder that so many philosophers throughout the ages talk about the harmony or the coincidence of opposites as like a core part of the philosophical journey, you know, back to Origina through, you know, it's definitely there like in Eastern philosophy. And I was thinking, Daniel, like you kind of gave me like the start to my wedding vows. Like I'm gonna be, you know, about to slip the ring and be like, before you, women were just a generalization, and then I met the particular, and I just fell in love. Hopefully I'll meet someone who like doesn't think that's the least sexy thing you can say. But yeah, I mean, Aspasia said something in the chat that I thought was really interesting about reclaiming the experience of the tragedy you already experienced to basically get past seeing it everywhere around you. And you know, as just like someone who, I definitely felt like I was living in a tragedy, you know, for the first 18-20 years of my life. And there's so much confirmation bias that comes with that, of like, and there's so much rationalization of staying stagnant, because it's like, well, I'm already a victim of this circumstance, and so there's all these reasons that it's stacked against me to, you know, I look at people thriving around me and it's like, well, they had great parents. And sometimes I still do this. Like I still have that like pattern of thought where I'm like, well, you know, you encounter like an actor or an artist you really admire, and then you learn that they just had like, they were children of actors and they just had like, you know, this amazing childhood. And it's always like, well, okay, like, you know, it's not going to be me because I had the scarlet letter of my childhood or whatever. And I think like the way out of that is to truly encounter that story and that narrative, but be able to, like, in the therapy that I benefited from, acceptance commitment therapy, they talk about seeing self in context, like seeing the 7-8-year-old boy who is, you know, being flagellated by his dad or by his teacher and made to feel inferior or less than, but then through, like, you know, different mindfulness techniques, being able to like exact yourself out of that and realize that while that may be a part of you, it is not the whole of you. And so it's like, it's really going into the particular, and it's really specifying like, this is a this is an aspect of the self, but it is not the self. And therefore it is also not the universal. It's not the external as well. And I mean, that's the birthplace of agency. Like Frankl, I remember taking a cognition class in in college, and like the first quote that was like the first day when we walked in was like a quote from Frankl, and it was like, cognition is the space between reaction and response. And I think that's, something like therapy, a good therapy, like trains you to first notice that there is a gap. Because so often people come into therapy and it's just reaction after reaction after reaction that their life is going. And just to like create some space of like, oh, like that's actually not all that's available here. There's this whole undercurrent of, if I go just like a layer beneath the fear or the anxiety, there's all of this, we talk like play and exploration and curiosity and like and courage, like all these things that like are not accessible, like just at that reactivity piece. And so I think there's something there about like going into the particular. Then what I wonder is like, because the shadow of that is people who think that their unique particularness should be imposed on the world, and the whole world should see the world through the lenses that they have. And so like making sure that like the quality of seeing and the quality of experience is seeing a world in a grain of sand, but being open to the fact that the world that everyone else sees is different. And maybe there's like a teleological like unifying substrate or something that like connects all of that. But then on the other side, it's like, it can kind of just be corrupted as well. It's like, well, I'm just going to live my truth. I'm just going to live in my uniqueness. And like, I'm not going to care about your particularity. Right. And so I'm so in love with my particularity that I have no reason to leave the house and to encounter the other. So there's all sorts of like trap doors with all of this. And it's a mystery to me how to kind of walk that line and make sure you kind of keep everything in right relation. But I'll pass it back.
Well, I mean, a lot of the relation will come down to that one-of-oneness as well, right? To the individual and having the kind of body and the disposition to actually, apprehend it. Here's the problem. I think that right relation almost has to be a coming before the eyes. It has to be an apprehension, which means it has to be relation. There is no thing you can understand that would therefore be the right way. But that means ultimately the opportunity here is this is all pointing to what education becomes in the world of AI. It becomes actually the training and facilitation of actually the individual to have these apprehending capacities to meet people in their individuality, to actually find the quote unquote right way, one of oneness, of which is then a creative opening, a kind of creative possibility that the apprehension makes possible. There's more to be said, but I'll give it to Aspasia. So I will also say this, you're right, there has to be so here's the $1 million question. How do you have a unifying substrate that entails otherness, but you still have monism? Like without positing a second substance, right? That's the giant philosophical question, okay? Like how do you have some sort of shared something, an underlying substrate that nevertheless maintains real otherness, real difference is real, and yet you have a monism, a single substance versus, a single versus positing a multiplicity, right? I will argue it has to be time space. It has to be a Gödel gestalt. It has to be an unfolding, and it has to be possibility space itself, all unfolding. But I think we can help to actually show this mechanism when we understand, in my opinion, how the apprehension works and why it is tied precisely to the arising of new phenomenon. But I will pause and I will give it to Aspasia. And then if anyone has anything to say, Aspasia, it's a delight to have you on this fine day.
Oh, I was so pleased to see you guys were still here. I just wanted to say to the piece around playing out a tragedy that one has already lived in an attempt to ultimately avoid the full emotional experience of the tragedy you already lived that you could not bear at the time. And so instead we see it out in our future and out in the world. And actually what happens is we start to behave in a way that we are only part of ourselves. We only give to others and give to the world and experience relationship in the world through a very confined, distorted funneling of our full self, if we call it that, our true self. And because of that, then yeah, we get the information back. But that's distorted. Like that is not response to our fuller self. The point I'm trying to make is my sense is that actually to get out of this kind of trapped loop of the tragedy, you need to go. It's below narrative. It's in my view, you need to pull up. You need to pull up the emotion. And I mean this experientially. I don't mean anything about like outward behavior. You need to have a full body felt experience of the full intensity of that emotion that you were never able to have at the time where all of this started to develop, all of these defenses and all of this stuff whereby you start to fear a tragedy in your life. The tragedy already happened. Right? It already happened at some point. It came with an intense emotional response inside you that for whatever reason you were unable to have at the time. Could be to do with your age. You were so young you couldn't bear it. Might be a failure of caregivers, the other, whatever. And then it's probably subsequently repeated over time. You need, the way that you get to it is to almost surrender to the idea that you could even think about what it was. Instead, you feel, you give priority to the emotional bodily experience. And that arises and you finally have it, and you have it with another person if you're doing it in the context of a therapy. And through that, you come to learn something new about the other. And from there, my experience has been that from there, then the stuff that is more like a narrative becomes obvious to you and available. You see all the narratives that were at play, even the ones that were hidden. You see all that. It just becomes obvious to you, but it's through the portal first of full emotional experience. Now, there are all sorts of ways that can go terribly wrong, but I just want to put that in there. There's so much of what we worry about, so many of our fears, which are constricting forces on our behavior, ultimately, are nothing to do with the probability of the future per se. They are to do with things that have already happened to us, that we have not been able to take in fully. We have not been able to allow as a full part of our physiology, which is ultimately the thing that if we can do now and reclaim as adults, clarifies and demystifies and just gets rid of a lot of confusion and gets rid of fears, all these fears that dictate how we move in every moment. They just melt away. And there's obviously layers of this. You do that with one thing and then there's something else maybe. But yeah, I just want to make a claim there for the, I guess, more of the psychoanalytic and psychodynamic nature of things. And there's obviously levels to this, and it's not to say anything about any other form of psychotherapy that gets at it in a different way, but there are particular layers that through my many years of experience of this, you can get so far, and then unless you kind of let the emotional thread lead, And that requires suspending, like that requires, this is the trust thing, because it's frightening, because I don't know, I don't have any words yet to explain what this might be about, and that's what's terrorizing about it. I have no idea what's about to come up. Yeah, anyway, just want to throw that in.
No, magnificent. And thank you all for being here this evening. I suppose I should take care of work obligations, et cetera, so forth at the venue. We do have, but what you just said was very important. So if you don't go into your history, then you tend to be stuck in repetitions, like cycles. You can't get out of these different things. The way you go into your history is not by understanding, but by undergoing the full emotional experience. And then on the other side of that is an apprehension, a coming before the eyes. And it is very interesting how in many religious traditions, like Dante going through the Inferno, then there's it's not that you have to understand anything, it's like whole and entire, actually. It's more of a Gestalt experience. When you go into your history, you're actually realizing your particularity. So you realize you're one of oneness, and that opens up the future. You don't open up the future by going to the future. You open up the future by going to your history, because that is the deepening and feeling of your particularity. So this is like we were saying, generality seems open, but actually it's just repetition. Just like if you don't go into your history, you're stuck in loops, right? So we think of woman versus Michelle, and you think, no, I don't want to commit to like Michelle or whatever because I want more possibility. No, you have less possibility because you're just going to repeat your preset ideas, and actually generalities just are going to be, that's just going to be the arena where you repeat your childhood enclosures, your childhood tendencies that you've never faced, right? So as you move from woman to Michelle, you get more possibility because you get more quirkiness. It's like the saint coming close to God. You get more individual possibilities. Likewise, when you go into your history and you feel it fully, then you open up, because now you're not necessarily going to be stuck in those cycles, in those repetitions. And the argument would be, you have to go into your history and have a full emotional experience precisely to make woman Michelle. That these two things go together, actually. You will not be able to have the relationship with a particular phenomenon to make it definitive as Michelle unless you yourself have done the work to particularize yourself, which you do by feeling. You do by the work of the emotion, because that leads to apprehension. And apprehension is the creative act. Apprehension is what I have in mind when Jockin's saying come before the heart, coming before the heart. A word I use is apprehension, and I think the apprehension is also tied to the authentic resonance. There is a sense in, I think authentic resonance is the resonance comes from a feeling of the movement toward particularization. And it is, the resonance is, as we got actual, we created possibility. What ends up happening is most people say actual here, possibility there, and they look for possibility by getting away from the actual. That's actually how you get away from possibility. You just get repetition because you never face your history, actually. The way you get the possible is by fully feeling the actual, which requires you and Dante to go through the inferno, to go through the wound, to go through the difficulty. If you do not do that, then you are not actually going to be able to meet the condition necessary for you to make a woman become a Michelle, a definitive, and thus open up possibility space. So everything you said is exactly right. Completely agree. The secret to possibility is history. The secret to possibility is not imagination. That's the great mistake. The secret to possibility is actually facing history and having imagination be apprehended. Great novels, when novelists talk about their greatest creative acts, they didn't get to it through freaking understand it. It's like a vision. They talk about visions and apprehension and sights, entirety and all at once, and then boom, the creative. It's getting windy, and it's probably messing up the mic. I don't know. But the creative acts tend to be visionary and apprehensive, right? And also, I don't think it's by chance that creative acts tend to have a lot of facing of the self, facing of going into oneself, right? Because when you come into yourself, you particularize yourself, of which then makes you capable of the coming before the eyes, because what comes before your eyes is particularly you. The more you come to terms with yourself means you unlock within yourself the capacity of the coming before the eyes, of which is the making a generality, a particularity. So it's creativity all the way down. It's an increase of possibility space all the way down. And if time space is possibility space, if reality is possibility space, then this as a teleology is not top down. It is actually an alignment of what is, because what is an actual meaning, the condition of possibility to realize things as particular, to thus unlock new creative possibilities in them. And that is what the universe is, and is realized in the subject through the moment of apprehension and the movement of apprehension. So for me, why then? Because now we have to then describe what is ontologically in phenomenon evidence. Why is it apprehension works this way? When you get more things, you get more apprehension. The way I describe or think about the coming before the eyes, and this is shocking me in the ear constantly, I don't know why, is that, when you have a bunch of those little pictures and you stand in the right place and then suddenly there's a big picture. Nabokov at the end of Spoke Memory talked about the finding the sailor that could. You have a bunch of little pictures and then you see the pattern, you see the whole, right? Okay, it just kind of appears, right? That's how apprehension works. So the more that is created, the more that arises in, say, causal determination, there are the more things. The more there are things, it's like having more of those small pictures that when you see the big picture, all the small pictures make out. When you see the big picture, that's an apprehension, and that is real. And now you have added a creativity to the causal determination that is not there without the apprehension. And now that you've apprehended that, you as a subject can change how you behave to do different things, to then add different phenomenon into the world that can come together with other phenomenon that you then apprehend. And now you've added another dimension, another relation, and then that changes how you behave. And this is how you get an ever unfolding in a monad, with a monism, because it has to be a Gödel gestalt. The appearance of an other substance comes from the lack in the gestalt that is actually apathetic, and that lack is you as a subject apprehending new things that add that to reality. So this is how you have freedom, and you have creation as distinct from causation, and time space is not just cause and effect. Cause and effect is the structure of which makes sure there's always phenomenon appearing, so that you can apprehend them like those little pictures in new ways that adds a creative possibility to the causal determination that then is folded into it, that now there's a new thing that can be apprehended in a new way, and that goes on forever. And the apprehension is the negentropy that is part of the entropy of the causation that means that we don't have to end in a heat death. We could, if we stop apprehending, we could, if we stop doing the work of being particular and facing ourselves and going into negativity and integrating with lack, we could end up in a great ultimate heat death that causation is leading to. But if we actually face ourselves and do the work of the full emotional experience and thus earn the capacity of apprehending, then it is possible for there to be a negentropic addition to what is, of which is afforded by the Gödel gestalt as time space. That's mechanism of being itself is the apprehension and the coming before the eyes, and this is how all things can be new. I do have to go to work. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. Aspasia, wonderful to see you. Jock and Seth, Daniel, Michael, thank you so much. It's been a complete delight. All the best to you. Thank you so much. All the best.